The autumn wind carried whispers of hardship through Cedar Ridge, Montana, as 7-year-old Emma Sullivan clutched her father's calloused hand. The town square buzzed with nervous energy as families gathered for the monthly supply distribution, their faces etched with the quiet desperation of another harsh winter approaching. When the mountain woman appeared, tall, weathered and solitary as always, conversations ceased. Martha Blackwood commanded respect through her reputation for fairness and her mysterious past that no one dared question. She'd helped struggling families before, but always on her terms. Little Emma broke free from her father's grip and approached the formidable woman with the fearless innocence only children possess. "Please take my father. He works hard," she begged, tears streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks. The crowd held its breath, expecting rejection. But what would a woman who'd sworn off human attachment say to a child's desperate plea? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thomas Sullivan stood frozen as his daughter's words echoed across the town square, his weathered hands gripping the mining tools that had become both his salvation and his burden. The pickaxe and shovel bore the scratches and dents of countless hours spent in the collapsed Silverbrook mine, tools that now served him in odd jobs around Cedar Ridge when work could be found. At 35, Thomas carried the weight of loss in his shoulders and the determination of survival in his eyes. The mine closure 18 months ago had stripped away not just his livelihood, but his sense of purpose. Sarah had died giving birth to Emma 7 years prior, leaving him to navigate parenthood alone while the town's economy crumbled around them. Martha Blackwood studied the child before her with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. The girl's earnest face reminded her of another little one, lost to fever and time. Emma's simple dress, mended multiple times with careful stitches, told the story of a father doing his best with limited means. "Your father works hard, does he?" Martha's voice carried the authority of mountain winds and winter storms. Emma nodded vigorously, unaware of the tension her boldness had created. "He fixes things for people and helps Mrs. Henderson with her roof and carries heavy things for old Mr. Peterson. But sometimes there's no work and we eat soup for lots of days." Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks at his daughter's innocent honesty. Pride warred with desperation as he watched this strange woman consider his child's request. Martha Blackwood owned 300 acres of prime mountain land, raised cattle and sheep, and lived entirely on her own terms. Rumors suggested she'd come west after some tragedy back east, but no one dared ask directly. "And what makes you think I need help?" Martha asked Emma, though her gaze shifted to Thomas. "Because nobody should live all alone," Emma replied with the simple wisdom of childhood. "And Papa says you have the biggest garden in all of Montana, and gardens need lots of help." A murmur rippled through the gathered townspeople. Martha's self-sufficiency was legendary, but so was her isolation. She appeared in town once monthly for supplies, conducted her business with polite efficiency, and departed without social pleasantries. Martha's attention turned fully to Thomas. "You have experience with farming." Thomas cleared his throat, acutely aware of every eye upon them. "Some, ma'am. Grew up on my grandfather's farm in Ohio before the mining work brought me west. I understand soil and growing seasons, animal care, been helping folks around town with whatever needs doing." Mining work. Martha's tone suggested she understood the implications of that particular career's uncertainties. "Yes, ma'am, 15 years underground before the vein played out." Thomas straightened his shoulders. "I'm not afraid of hard work and I learn quick." Martha studied him with the same intensity she might examine a horse she was considering purchasing. Thomas met her gaze steadily, recognizing a test when he saw one. Around them, the crowd waited in fascination and speculation. "Papa's really strong," Emma added helpfully. "He carried our whole stove when we moved to the little house." The little house was actually a converted tool shed behind the boarding house, barely large enough for 2 people, but all they could afford. Thomas had made it as comfortable as possible, building Emma a proper bed and installing a small window to let in light. Martha's expression remained unreadable. "Strong backs are common enough, characters rarer." "Yes, ma'am," Thomas replied simply. For long moments the only sounds were autumn wind through bare trees and the distant lowing of cattle. Martha seemed to wrestle with some internal debate, her weathered hands clasped behind her back. "I'll consider it," she said finally, her words dropping like stones into still water. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible. No one had expected Martha Blackwood to even acknowledge Emma's request, much less give it serious thought. "There would be conditions," Martha continued, her gaze never leaving Thomas. "Specific terms and expectations. This wouldn't be charity." Thomas nodded, relief and apprehension flooding through him in equal measure. "I understand, ma'am. I appreciate your consideration." Emma beamed as if Christmas had arrived early, bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. "Does that mean yes? Does that mean Papa can help you?" Martha's lips quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "It means we'll discuss possibilities, child. Nothing more than that for now." As the supply distribution resumed around them, Thomas realized his life had just shifted on its axis. Whatever Martha Blackwood decided, nothing would ever be quite the same again. Martha Blackwood retreated to her mountain cabin that evening, with Emma's words echoing in her mind like church bells on Sunday morning. The child's innocent plea had stirred something she'd buried deep beneath years of solitary routine and carefully constructed walls. Her fingers found the worn gold band she kept hidden in her apron pocket, a weight she carried everywhere but never acknowledged. Samuel's wedding ring had remained there for 8 years, ever since she'd removed it from his cold hand and placed it next to their daughter's tiny one in the cemetery outside of St. Louis. The cabin reflected her self-imposed exile from human connection. Every piece of furniture served a practical purpose, nothing decorative or sentimental visible to casual observers. She'd built this life with deliberate austerity, each Spartan choice reinforcing her commitment to independence and emotional distance. But tonight, as she lit her evening lamp and prepared her solitary meal, Martha found herself remembering Sarah's laugh. Her daughter had possessed Emma's same fearless spirit, the way she'd approach strangers in the market, with questions and observations that delighted everyone she met. The fever had taken Sarah so quickly, one day racing through wildflowers behind their St. Louis home, the next burning with illness that no doctor could cure. Samuel had followed 6 months later, his heart simply stopping, as if it couldn't bear the weight of grief any longer. Martha had sold everything and headed west, seeking distance from memories that haunted every familiar corner. The Montana Territory offered space and solitude, demanding survival skills that left little time for dwelling on loss. She'd proven herself capable of building a life entirely on her own terms. Yet watching Thomas Sullivan struggle with single parenthood had triggered unwelcome recognition. She understood the exhaustion in his shoulders, the worry lines around his eyes, the way he watched Emma with fierce protectiveness mixed with overwhelming responsibility. The town's reaction to Emma's request hadn't surprised her. Cedar Ridge viewed Martha Blackwood as an oddity, to be respected from a distance. She provided occasional help during crises, but never invited closer acquaintance. People speculated about her past in whispered conversations she pretended not to overhear. Some claimed she'd been married to a wealthy man back east who died in the war. Others suggested she'd fled some scandal or tragedy. The truth lay somewhere between speculation and sympathy, but Martha had never corrected their assumptions or provided clearer explanations. Her isolation had become comfortable over the years, predictable routines replacing the chaos of loss and upheaval. She knew exactly what each day would bring, controlled every variable, answered to no one's expectations or needs but her own. Emma's boldness had shattered that carefully maintained equilibrium. The child's unwavering belief that Martha could solve their problems spoke to something she'd thought permanently silenced. Maternal instincts she'd buried with Sarah stirred uncomfortably to life. Thomas Sullivan represented complications she'd spent years avoiding. His quiet dignity in the face of poverty impressed her despite her determination to remain uninvolved. She'd observed him around town, noting how he never complained or made excuses, simply worked whatever jobs were available, and raised his daughter with obvious devotion. The mining tools he carried told their own story of adaptation and perseverance. Men who'd spent their lives underground often struggled with surface work, but Thomas had embraced whatever opportunities arose. She'd heard Mrs. Henderson praise his roof repairs and seen him helping elderly residents with tasks their age made difficult. But accepting his help would mean disrupting the solitude she'd cultivated so carefully. It would require conversation, shared meals, the daily negotiations that came with human proximity. Worst of all, it might awaken feelings she'd worked so hard to suppress. Martha fingered Samuel's ring, remembering the weight of it on her own hand during their brief, happy marriage. They'd planned to fill their home with children, to build something lasting and meaningful together. Those dreams had died with Sarah, buried in ground still too far away to visit. Yet something about Emma's desperate faith stirred echoes of the woman she'd once been. The child saw past Martha's carefully constructed barriers to some possibility even Martha couldn't clearly identify. Outside her cabin, wind moved through pine trees with sounds that once comforted, but tonight seemed lonely. The approaching winter would be harsh, as always, but she'd weathered 8 of them alone and expected to weather many more. Still, as she prepared for bed, Martha found herself wondering what it might feel like to hear another adult voice over morning coffee, to share the satisfaction of completed tasks, to watch a child discover the simple magic of growing things. Samuel's ring felt heavier in her pocket as she finally allowed herself to consider the impossible. The hand-carved wooden cross stood weathered but resolute near the edge of Martha's property, overlooking the valley where Cedar Ridge nestled among rolling hills. She'd carved it herself during those first terrible months after arriving in Montana, when grief had demanded some physical expression of loss that words couldn't contain. Samuel and Sarah's names were etched into the pine wood, along with dates that marked the boundaries of her former happiness. Each morning, Martha's first task involved checking this simple memorial, clearing away fallen leaves or snow, ensuring the elements hadn't obscured the careful lettering that represented her family's brief existence. The cross marked more than memory. It served as a boundary marker for the emotional territory Martha refused to cross. Beyond this point lay the life she'd built from necessity rather than hope, the daily routines that kept grief at manageable distance. Her homestead sprawled across 300 acres of prime mountain land, testament to 8 years of determined self-sufficiency. The main cabin sat positioned to catch morning sun, while providing protection from harsh winter winds. Outbuildings included a substantial barn, chicken coop, root cellar and workshop, where Martha crafted most items she couldn't purchase in town. The garden represented her greatest pride and most practical achievement. Terraced plots followed the natural slope of the land, each section planned for optimal growing conditions. Root vegetables dominated the lower areas where soil retained moisture longest. Herbs and flowers claimed the middle terraces, while hardy grains occupied the highest ground. Martha's cattle grazed in meadows she'd cleared herself, their breeding carefully managed to produce stock suited for harsh mountain conditions. 20 head provided sufficient beef for her needs, plus surplus for trading in town. The milk cows supplied butter and cheese she aged in the cool darkness of her root cellar. Everything about the homestead reflected careful planning and stubborn independence Martha had learned through necessity skills most men never mastered. She could build fence, repair machinery, treat sick animals, and preserve enough food to survive months of winter isolation. The work demanded constant attention and physical strength that challenged her daily. At 42, Martha moved with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to waste neither motion nor energy. Her hands bore calluses and scars that told stories of hard-won competence, yet the solitude that once provided comfort had begun feeling oppressive. Conversations with animals and internal monologues couldn't entirely replace human companionship. She'd created a life of remarkable self-sufficiency that sometimes felt more like imprisonment than freedom. Thomas Sullivan's situation struck uncomfortable chords of recognition. She'd observed his determined efforts to provide for Emma while maintaining dignity despite circumstances beyond his control. The man possessed qualities she respected: persistence, devotion to his child, willingness to adapt when life demanded change. The town's opinion of their potential arrangement ranged from scandal to sympathy. Cedar Ridge operated according to unspoken social rules that Martha had always ignored, but she understood the gossip her decision would generate. A widow living alone with a man and his daughter would provide conversation for months. Pastor Williams had approached her after Sunday service the week before, expressing concern about appearances and moral implications. Martha had listened politely before reminding him that her relationship with God didn't require community approval or clerical oversight, but Emma's desperate plea had awakened something she'd thought permanently dormant. The child's absolute faith that Martha could solve their problems spoke to maternal instincts that grief had silenced but not destroyed. Sarah had possessed that same fearless certainty that adults would somehow make everything right. Standing beside the wooden cross that evening, Martha allowed herself to imagine sharing her morning coffee with another adult voice, discussing plans for spring planting, watching Emma discover the satisfaction of growing things from seeds to harvest. The image felt both appealing and terrifying. Opening her life to others meant risking the peace she'd fought so hard to achieve. It meant conversations, compromises, the daily negotiations that came with shared space and mutual dependence. Worse, it meant the possibility of loss again. People left, through choice or circumstance or death. Martha had learned that lesson with devastating thoroughness. Building walls against such possibilities had become essential survival strategy. Yet Emma's innocent request had planted seeds of possibility in soil Martha had thought permanently barren. The child's unwavering belief that her father belonged here, helping with work that required strength and skill, suggested solutions Martha hadn't considered. As darkness settled over her mountain domain, Martha touched the wooden cross with fingers that remembered carving each letter. Samuel and Sarah would remain part of her always, but perhaps their memory could coexist with new connections rather than prohibiting them entirely. The decision she faced would alter everything about the life she'd constructed so carefully. But for the first time in 8 years, Martha found herself considering whether change might bring growth rather than only loss. 3 days after Emma's bold request, Martha found herself standing in her parlor, staring at the faded photograph she kept hidden in her bureau drawer. The image showed a laughing little girl with dark curls and mischievous eyes, captured by a traveling photographer during happier times in St. Louis. Sarah's resemblance to Emma Sullivan was striking enough to make Martha's breath catch each time she glimpsed the connection. The photograph had yellowed at the edges, but Sarah's smile remained as bright as the day she'd charmed the photographer into taking an extra portrait. That same fearless joy had characterized everything about Martha's daughter, from her approach to strangers to her delight in simple pleasures like puddle jumping and butterfly chasing. Martha traced the image with one finger, remembering how Sarah had begged to help with garden work, tiny hands more hindrance than help, but eager to participate in whatever occupied her mother's attention. The child had possessed an intuitive understanding of growing things, able to sense when plants needed water or which seedlings would thrive. A knock at her door interrupted these dangerous memories. Thomas Sullivan stood on her porch, hat in hand, with Emma beside him clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers. The child's offering represented the kind of thoughtful gesture that would have delighted Sarah. "Miss Blackwood," Thomas began formally, "I wanted to thank you for considering Emma's request. I know it was unusual." Martha invited them inside, noticing how Thomas's eyes assessed her home with the practical gaze of a man who understood construction and maintenance. He noted the solid furniture, the efficient arrangement of space, the evidence of self-sufficiency that required constant attention. Emma presented her flowers with ceremony that made Martha's chest tight with recognition. "These are for you because Papa says you're thinking about helping us, and thinking is hard work." The simple bouquet contained autumn asters and goldenrod, wildflowers that grew in abundance but had been selected with careful attention to color and arrangement. Emma's small hands had tied them with a strip of cloth torn from her own hair ribbon. "They're very beautiful," Martha said, accepting the gift with more emotion than she'd felt in years. "Would you like some milk and cookies while your father and I discuss business?" As Emma settled at the kitchen table with her treat, Martha and Thomas moved to the parlor where conversation could proceed without little ears overhearing adult concerns. "I'll be direct," Martha began, her business voice replacing the softer tone she'd used with Emma. "I do need help with the property. Winter preparation alone requires more work than I can manage efficiently." Thomas nodded, relieved to discuss practical matters rather than navigate the emotional complexity of their situation. "What kind of help specifically? Fence repairs, firewood cutting, barn maintenance, livestock care during storms. The root cellar needs reinforcing, and I've been meaning to expand the chicken coop before cold weather arrives." "I can handle all of that," Thomas replied confidently. "Any specialized skills or techniques you prefer?" Martha appreciated his straightforward approach. Many men would have assumed they knew better than a woman about property management, but Thomas asked questions rather than making suggestions. "I have specific methods for everything," she said. "Been developing systems for 8 years that work for this climate and terrain. You'd need to learn my ways rather than imposing your own." Understood completely. There would be living arrangements to consider. Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks, despite her determination to treat this as purely business. "You and Emma would need proper housing. The cabin has a spare room," but Thomas cleared his throat, equally uncomfortable with the implications. "I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation or create awkward situations. Maybe we could build a small cabin nearby, something separate but close enough for work efficiency." The suggestion solved several problems while creating others. Separate housing would address propriety concerns, but require significant construction effort. Winter was approaching rapidly, leaving little time for major building projects. "We could make temporary arrangements through winter," Martha said slowly. "Use the spare room with proper understanding about boundaries and expectations. Come spring, we could build something more permanent if the arrangement works out." Emma's laughter drifted from the kitchen, where she'd apparently discovered Martha's cat, a grey tabby named Duchess, who rarely showed herself to visitors. The sound of childish delight mixed with feline purring created domestic music Martha hadn't heard since Sarah's time. "There would be financial considerations," Thomas said carefully. "I can't pay much for housing, but I'm willing to work for room and board, plus whatever wages the work merits." Martha waved away his concern. "Fair exchange of labor for necessities. We'll work out details as we go." They emerged from the parlor to find Emma on the floor, playing with Duchess while sharing her cookies with obvious enjoyment. The scene struck Martha as perfectly natural, as if this child belonged in her kitchen, bringing life to spaces that had been silent too long. "So," Emma asked hopefully, "does this mean Papa can help you now?" Martha pulled out a sheet of paper and her best pen, the formal contract, taking shape as she outlined expectations with methodical precision. The legal work agreement would protect them both from misunderstandings and provide clear boundaries for their unusual arrangement. "First condition," Martha began, writing in her careful script, "work begins at dawn and ends at sunset, 6 days a week. Sunday remains a day of rest." Thomas nodded, watching her document each requirement. "Understood." "Second, no drinking alcohol on the property. I won't tolerate drunkenness or behavior that endangers Emma's welfare." "I don't drink," Thomas replied simply. "Haven't touched liquor since Emma was born." Martha felt a flicker of approval at his response. "Third, no questions about my personal history or family. I value privacy and expect it to be respected, absolutely." Thomas shifted uncomfortably but agreed. "Your past is your business, Miss Blackwood." "Fourth, Emma's education cannot be neglected. She'll attend school in town when weather permits, and I expect her studies to be supervised properly. Of course, education is important." Martha continued writing, establishing rules about meals, household responsibilities, and use of equipment. Each condition reflected hard-won knowledge about maintaining order and preventing complications. "The arrangement is temporary," she emphasized, looking up from her writing. "We'll evaluate the situation after spring planting. Either party can terminate the agreement with 2 weeks' notice." Thomas understood the escape clause, protected them both from commitments that might prove unworkable. "That seems fair." "Fifth condition might be the most important," Martha said, her pen hovering over the paper. "This is a business arrangement, nothing more. Personal feelings or romantic notions have no place in our working relationship." Heat flooded Thomas's face at her directness, but he appreciated the clarity. "Absolutely understood." Emma wandered in from the kitchen, still carrying Duchess, oblivious to the adult tensions her simple request had created. "Are you writing down that Papa gets to help you?" "We're establishing rules," Martha explained gently, "like the rules you follow at school." "Oh," Emma considered this seriously. "Do I get rules too?" Martha found herself smiling despite her determination to maintain formality. "What rules do you think you should have?" "No bothering you when you're working hard, no touching things that aren't mine, helping with chores that aren't too big for me." Emma's list demonstrated maturity beyond her years. "Those are excellent rules," Martha agreed, adding them to her contract. Thomas watched this exchange with growing amazement. Emma had spent 3 days talking about nothing but Miss Blackwood's possible agreement to their arrangement. His daughter possessed an uncanny ability to see past adult complications to simple human needs. "When can we move here?" Emma asked eagerly. "Moving requires preparation," Martha replied practically. "We need to ready the spare room, discuss household routines, gather your belongings from town." Today, Emma's hopefulness made both adults smile. "Perhaps by week's end," Martha conceded. "That gives us time to prepare properly." Thomas felt relief mixed with apprehension as reality settled around their agreement. Martha Blackwood's reputation for fairness and competence made her an ideal employer, but living in such close proximity would test boundaries they'd established on paper. The contract, once completed, contained 12 specific conditions covering everything, from work schedules to personal conduct. Martha read each clause aloud, ensuring Thomas understood every expectation before asking him to sign. "This protects us both," she explained, offering him the pen. "Clear agreements prevent misunderstandings." Thomas signed carefully, his mining roughened hands making the pen look delicate. "Thank you for giving us this opportunity, Miss Blackwood. I won't disappoint you." "See that you don't," Martha replied, but her tone carried warmth rather than warning. Emma clapped her hands with delight, startling Duchess into leaping from her arms. "We're going to live on the mountain. I can help with the chickens and learn about gardens, and maybe Duchess will be my friend." Martha felt an unexpected tightness in her throat, watching Emma's excitement. The child's joy at simple things reminded her forcefully of Sarah's similar enthusiasm for new experiences. "We'll start with a trial period," Martha cautioned, though Emma's happiness was infectious. "Living here requires hard work and following rules." "I'm good at rules," Emma assured her solemnly. "Papa taught me lots of them." As Thomas and Emma prepared to leave, Martha walked them to the porch, where afternoon light painted the valley in shades of gold and amber. The beauty of her mountain home struck her anew, imagined now through the eyes of a child who would see magic in ordinary things. "We'll come Saturday morning with our belongings," Thomas said, settling his hat firmly. "Is there anything specific you need us to bring?" "Just yourselves," Martha replied, watching Emma skip toward their wagon with boundless energy. The signed contract lay on her kitchen table, formal words that would reshape her carefully ordered existence. For better or worse, Martha Blackwood had just opened her solitary life to complications she'd spent 8 years avoiding. Martha handed Thomas her worn leather-work gloves on his first morning, the gesture both practical and symbolic. The gloves had protected her hands through 8 years of mountain labor, their supple leather molded to her grip from countless hours of fence repair, wood splitting, and barn maintenance. "These will fit better than those torn ones you're wearing," she said, noting how Thomas's gloves held together more by habit than by remaining material. "Can't work efficiently if your hands are getting cut up." Thomas accepted the gloves with surprising reverence, understanding they represented trust as much as equipment. "Thank you. I'll take good care of them." The morning began before sunrise, Martha leading Thomas through her daily routine with the efficiency of someone who'd perfected every movement. She moved through her property like a general surveying troops, noting details that escaped untrained observation. "Fence line runs 3 miles total," she explained, pointing toward posts that marked her boundaries. "I check the whole perimeter weekly. Cattle find every weakness, and neighbors sometimes get careless about property lines." Thomas followed her methodical inspection, learning to see through her experienced eyes. She pointed out signs of animal damage, weather stress, and normal wear that required attention before becoming serious problems. "This section needs replacing completely," Martha said, examining posts that showed rot near ground level. "Wood's good above the soil line, but roots have been undermining the foundations." Thomas knelt beside the failing fence, his mining experience helping him understand structural problems. "Ground's been shifting. Probably need to dig deeper, maybe add gravel for drainage." Martha felt a flicker of approval at his assessment. Many men would have suggested quick fixes rather than addressing underlying causes. "Exactly right. No point in temporary repairs that'll fail next season." They worked together replacing the damaged section, their movements gradually synchronizing as Thomas learned Martha's methods. She insisted on precise measurements, quality materials, and construction that would last decades rather than years. "Why do it twice when you can do it right once?" she said, watching Thomas dig post holes to her exact specifications. Emma explored the property with Duchess as her guide, the cat leading her to interesting corners Martha rarely noticed anymore. The child's delight in simple discoveries reminded Martha how much wonder she'd stopped seeing in familiar surroundings. "Miss Martha," Emma called from near the chicken coop, "the chickens are talking to me." Martha smiled despite herself at Emma's interpretation of normal chicken conversation. "They're probably asking for their breakfast. Can I feed them?" "Tomorrow morning, after I show you how much and where," Martha replied. Chickens have specific needs. The afternoon brought Thomas's first real test, as Martha introduced him to her livestock. The cattle regarded him with suspicious indifference, while the horses required careful approach and patient handling. "Animals sense uncertainty," Martha explained, watching Thomas extend his hand for the mare to investigate. "Be confident but not aggressive. Let them decide you're trustworthy." Thomas had limited experience with horses, but his calm demeanor and willingness to follow Martha's instructions earned gradual acceptance from the animals. The mare, Belle, eventually allowed him to stroke her neck while Martha supervised approvingly. "She's particular about strangers," Martha admitted. "Good sign that she's accepting you." By evening, Thomas's hands ached despite the protection of Martha's gloves, and his back protested the unfamiliar demands of fence work. But he'd completed every task Martha assigned with competence that impressed her more than she showed. Emma helped prepare dinner, carefully washing vegetables under Martha's supervision while chattering about everything she'd discovered during her exploration. Her enthusiasm filled the cabin with sounds Martha hadn't realized she'd missed. "The barn has a ladder to the loft," Emma announced, "and there's mice up there, but Duchess says that's normal." "Duchess told you that, did she?" Thomas asked, amused by his daughter's certainty. "She showed me with her eyes. Cats are good at showing things." Martha served their meal with more formality than she'd used for solitary dinners, conscious of establishing household routines that would accommodate 3 people instead of 1. The conversation felt stiff initially, all of them navigating unfamiliar social territory. "Food's excellent," Thomas said, meaning it sincerely. "Been a long time since Emma had vegetables this fresh." "Everything comes from the garden," Martha replied. "Tastes better when you grow it yourself." As they settled into evening routines, Martha noticed how naturally Emma adapted to mountain life. The child helped with dishes without being asked, listened carefully to instructions about the stove, and treated Martha's possessions with respectful curiosity. Thomas studied Martha's extensive library while Emma played quietly with Duchess, both of them occupying space without demanding attention. The evening felt surprisingly comfortable despite underlying tensions about their unusual arrangement. When Martha handed Thomas her leather gloves again the next morning, the gesture carried new meaning. They were becoming partners in the daily work of survival, their shared labor creating bonds neither had anticipated when they'd signed their formal contract. The shared coffee pot became an unexpected ritual that marked the beginning and end of each workday. Martha had always prepared coffee for one, measuring precisely for her solitary consumption, but now she found herself adjusting quantities and timing to accommodate 3 people with different preferences and schedules. Thomas rose even earlier than Martha, a habit formed during mining days when shifts began before dawn. She discovered him in her kitchen that first Wednesday morning, already dressed and ready for work, waiting respectfully for permission to begin his day. "Coffee's ready," he said quietly, gesturing toward the pot where he'd prepared enough for both of them. "Hope you don't mind me starting it. Couldn't sleep much anyway." Martha accepted the offered cup, surprised by how perfectly Thomas had gauged the strength she preferred. "You're an early riser. Mining trains you to function before sunrise. Hard habit to break." Thomas sipped his own coffee, studying her kitchen with the appreciation of someone who understood efficient organization. "This is a well-planned setup you have here." The morning conversation became comfortable over subsequent days, 2 adults sharing quiet moments before the demands of physical labor began. Martha found herself looking forward to these peaceful interludes, the simple pleasure of discussing weather, work priorities, and Emma's daily discoveries. Emma joined them for breakfast but preferred milk to coffee, chattering about dreams and plans, while the adults planned their practical responsibilities. Her presence transformed meals from functional necessity into social occasions that Martha hadn't realized she'd missed. "Can I help Papa with the fence today?" Emma asked on Friday morning, her eagerness evident in every gesture. Martha considered the request carefully. Fence work involves tools that could be dangerous for small hands, but you could help by carrying supplies and watching for problems we might miss. Emma beamed at being included, even in a limited capacity. Thomas smiled at Martha over his daughter's head, recognizing her careful balance between safety and inclusion. The coffee ritual extended into evening conversations that gradually became less formal as familiarity replaced awkwardness. Martha discovered that Thomas possessed an unexpectedly broad education, their discussions ranging from practical farming techniques to philosophical questions about progress and change. "You read more than most people I've known," Martha observed one evening, noting the book Thomas had borrowed from her shelf. "Mining gave me time to think, and thinking led to reading," Thomas replied. "Always figured education was the one thing nobody could take away from you." Martha appreciated his perspective, recognizing a kindred spirit who valued knowledge for its own sake rather than for social advancement. Their conversations revealed shared values that their formal contract hadn't addressed. Emma's bedtime routine required adjustment, as Martha's cabin lacked the familiar comforts of their previous home. The child adapted with resilience that impressed Martha, accepting changed circumstances with optimism that reminded her painfully of Sarah's similar flexibility. "Story time," Thomas announced each evening, settling beside Emma's bed with whatever book Martha had suggested. His reading voice carried warmth and expression that brought characters to life, creating magic from simple words. Martha found herself listening from the kitchen, remembering when she'd performed similar rituals for Sarah. The sound of Thomas reading to Emma filled empty spaces in her home with life she'd forgotten she missed. The coffee pot witnessed their gradual transformation from strangers observing formal boundaries to people learning to share space comfortably. Martha began preparing larger meals without conscious decision, cooking for 3 instead of 1 as naturally as if she'd always fed a family. Thomas contributed to household routines without being asked, washing dishes while Martha prepared lessons for Emma's education, splitting firewood while she tended livestock, anticipating needs before they became urgent problems. "You don't have to do kitchen work," Martha told him one evening, watching him dry dishes with careful attention to her organizational system. "Seems fair to help with everything, not just outside work," Thomas replied. "Emma and I aren't used to being waited on." Their partnership extended beyond the terms outlined in their written agreement, evolving into genuine cooperation that surprised them both. Martha discovered that sharing responsibilities actually made her life easier rather than more complicated. The coffee pot sat between them during evening conversations that stretched longer each night, creating intimacy neither acknowledged directly. They discussed Emma's education, property improvements, and gradually more personal topics that revealed character beneath surface politeness. "Why did you choose farming?" Martha asked one evening, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve about personal questions. Thomas considered his answer carefully. "Growing things gives you hope. Every seed represents possibility. Every harvest proves you can create something from almost nothing. Mining takes things out of the earth, but farming puts life back into it." Martha felt unexpected recognition in his words, understanding for the first time why his presence felt so natural on her land. They shared more than work arrangements. They shared fundamental beliefs about the relationship between human effort and natural cycles. Martha surprised herself by spending her evening hours knitting a scarf for Emma, the soft wool flowing through her fingers as memories of creating similar gifts for Sarah surfaced unbidden. The hand-knitted scarf represented the first personal gesture she'd made toward another person in 8 years, each stitch a small rebellion against the emotional walls she'd built so carefully. The blue wool matched Emma's eyes perfectly, chosen without conscious thought from Martha's carefully hoarded supplies. She'd purchased the yarn 2 years ago, with no specific project in mind, drawn by its color and texture during one of her monthly town visits. Working by lamplight after Emma and Thomas had retired, Martha found the repetitive motion soothing in ways she'd forgotten. Knitting had once been meditation and creativity combined, producing practical items that carried love in every carefully formed stitch. Emma's delight in mountain life had gradually eroded Martha's resistance to emotional involvement. The child approached each day with enthusiasm that reminded Martha why she'd once found joy in simple things. Watching Emma discover the magic of fresh eggs and butter churning awakened maternal instincts Martha had thought permanently buried. "Miss Martha, why do the chickens make different sounds?" Emma had asked that morning, her curiosity endless and genuine. "They're talking about different things," Martha explained patiently. "That clucking means they're content. The squawking happens when something worries them." Emma absorbed every explanation with the intensity of a scholar, her questions revealing intelligence that deserved nurturing. Martha found herself looking forward to these teaching moments, rediscovering her own knowledge through Emma's fresh perspective. The crisis that truly tested their growing bonds arrived on a Tuesday morning when Thomas failed to appear for their usual coffee ritual. Martha found him in the spare room, burning with fever and barely conscious, his body finally succumbing to exhaustion he'd hidden for weeks. "Papa's sick," Emma whispered, her small face pale with worry. "He feels really hot and won't wake up properly." Martha's practical training took over, pushing aside panic as she assessed Thomas's condition. The fever suggested influenza or pneumonia, both potentially fatal without proper care. She sent Emma to fetch cool water while she gathered medicinal supplies from her well-stocked cabinet. "We're going to take care of him," Martha told Emma firmly, though her own heart raced with fear. "Your papa is strong, and we'll make sure he gets better." For 3 days, Martha nursed Thomas through the worst of his illness, applying cool compresses, forcing fluids between periods of consciousness, and monitoring his breathing with the vigilance of someone who'd lost too much already. Emma helped with quiet competence beyond her years, fetching supplies and providing comfort, without getting in Martha's way. The child's trust that Martha could heal her father carried weight that both honored and terrified her. During Thomas's delirium, he called out names Martha didn't recognize, mumbled conversations with people from his past, and occasionally spoke to his deceased wife with heartbreaking tenderness. Martha learned more about his character during those fevered revelations than weeks of careful conversation had revealed. "Sarah," he whispered one night, his voice thick with longing. "Emma needs you. I don't know how to raise her right." Martha's own grief stirred in response to his pain, recognizing the guilt and inadequacy that haunted parents left alone to guide children through life's complexities. She adjusted his covers with gentle hands, understanding his fears too well. The fever broke on Thursday evening, Thomas's eyes clearing as he focused on Martha's worried face beside his bed. His first coherent words were concern for Emma, rather than himself. "Is she all right? Has she been eating properly?" "She's fine," Martha assured him, relief flooding through her voice. "Worried about you, but fine. She's been helping me take care of you." Thomas tried to sit up, weakness forcing him back against the pillows. "I'm sorry for the trouble. Should have mentioned I wasn't feeling well." "Men," Martha muttered, but her tone carried affection rather than irritation, always thinking they can work through anything. That evening, Martha presented the finished scarf to Emma, who received it with wonder that made every hour of work worthwhile. The child wrapped the soft wool around her neck immediately, stroking the texture with reverent fingers. "You made this for me?" Emma's voice held amazement that anyone would spend time creating something specifically for her. "Winters get cold on the mountain," Martha said practically, though her heart felt full watching Emma's joy. "Thought you might need extra warmth." Emma's impulsive hug caught Martha off guard, small arms wrapping around her waist with fierce gratitude. The embrace broke through defenses Martha had maintained for years, maternal love flooding back with overwhelming intensity. Thomas watched this exchange from his bed, understanding that something fundamental had shifted in their relationship. The formal boundaries of their contract had dissolved into genuine affection that none of them could deny any longer. Martha's worn leather Bible emerged from its hiding place for the first time in months when Thomas expressed interest in reading scripture together on Sunday mornings. The book bore evidence of years of devoted study, its pages marked with careful annotations and passages underlined in fading ink that traced her spiritual journey through grief and healing. "I noticed you don't attend services in town," Thomas mentioned during his recovery. Still weak but determined to contribute something meaningful to their household. "Wondered if that meant you'd lost faith or just preferred privacy." Martha ran her fingers over the Bible's familiar cover, remembering when she'd carried it to church every Sunday beside Samuel, when they'd read evening devotions together while Sarah played at their feet. "Faith and church attendance aren't always the same thing." Thomas nodded with understanding that came from his own complicated relationship with organized religion. Emma asks questions about God sometimes. I try to answer, but theology was never my strength. What kind of questions? Martha found herself genuinely curious about Emma's spiritual development. Why her mama had to die, whether good people always get rewarded for being good, why some families have enough while others struggle. Thomas's voice carried the weight of trying to explain life's unfairness to an innocent child. Martha opened the Bible to passages she'd marked during her darkest periods, verses that had provided comfort when nothing else could penetrate her grief. These helped me when I couldn't understand God's plan. They began reading together that Sunday, Martha sharing insights gained through years of wrestling with doubt and faith. Thomas brought different perspectives shaped by his mining experience and single parenthood, their discussions deepening both their understanding and their connection. Emma listened with the absorption children brought to stories, asking questions that revealed remarkable spiritual intuition. Her observations often cut through theological complexity to reach simple truths that humbled both adults. If God loves everybody, why doesn't he just fix all the sad things? Emma asked during their second week of shared devotions. Martha and Thomas exchanged glances over her head, both struggling with questions they'd asked themselves countless times. Maybe, Martha said slowly, fixing things isn't always the same as healing them. Sometimes we have to learn and grow through difficult experiences, like when Papa got sick but then felt better, and we all felt closer. Emma's innocent wisdom struck directly at the heart of their situation. Exactly like that, Thomas replied, marveling at his daughter's ability to find meaning in circumstances that confused adults. Their shared study revealed common values that strengthened the foundation of their relationship beyond practical convenience. Both believed in the dignity of honest work, the importance of treating others with respect, regardless of social position, and the responsibility to help those facing difficulties. You have a gift for explaining complex ideas simply, Thomas told Martha after she'd helped Emma understand a particularly challenging parable. Ever consider teaching? Martha felt warmth at his praise, remembering dreams she'd abandoned after Sarah's death. I taught Sunday school briefly, before enjoyed working with children. Emma's lucky to have you guiding her education. She's learning things I never could have taught her. The Bible study sessions became precious time when their unusual family gathered for something beyond work and survival. Martha rediscovered joy in sharing knowledge and faith, while Thomas appreciated having spiritual guidance for Emma's development. Emma's questions often prompted discussions that continued long after she'd gone to bed. Martha and Thomas exploring theological concepts that related to their own experiences with loss, hope, and unexpected blessing. Do you think God brought us together? Thomas asked one evening, his voice careful as he ventured into territory their formal agreement hadn't addressed. Martha considered the question seriously, remembering her desperate loneliness before Emma's bold request had changed everything. I think God provides opportunities. We choose whether to recognize and accept them. And you think this, us living here together, working together, you think this is an opportunity? I think, Martha said slowly, that 3 people who were alone are now part of something larger than themselves. Whether that's God's plan or just fortunate coincidence, I'm grateful for it. Their conversations revealed shared beliefs about forgiveness, redemption, and the possibility of finding new purpose after devastating loss. The Bible became a bridge between their different backgrounds, providing common ground for exploring questions that mattered beyond daily survival. Thomas's respectful approach to Martha's faith encouraged her to share doubts and struggles she'd kept private for years. His own spiritual journey, marked by questioning and gradual acceptance, complemented her more traditional but deeply examined beliefs. Emma's presence in their devotions reminded both adults that faith traditions carried forward through generations, that their shared study was preparing her for spiritual challenges she'd faced throughout her life. The responsibility felt both humbling and inspiring, evidence that their unconventional family served purposes beyond their individual needs. Martha stood at her bedroom window, holding Samuel's pocket watch as the first snow of winter dusted her mountain peaks. The timepiece had stopped working 3 years ago, its hands frozen at 3:47, the exact moment she'd decided to wind it for the last time. Now, watching Thomas split firewood with the steady rhythm that had become the soundtrack of her days, she wondered if the time had come to let it go. The watch represented more than memory. It symbolized her commitment to living in the past rather than embracing whatever future might be possible. Samuel had carried it through their brief marriage, consulting it during important moments, trusting its precision to guide their shared time together. Emma burst through the kitchen door with snow in her hair and excitement in her voice, disrupting Martha's contemplation. "Miss Martha, Papa says the first snow means winter's really starting, and we need to check all the animals extra careful." "Your papa's right," Martha replied, slipping the watch back into its hiding place. "First snow tests whether we've prepared properly for cold weather." Thomas entered behind Emma, stamping snow from his boots with consideration for Martha's clean floors. His cheeks were red from cold and exertion, his eyes bright with satisfaction from work well done. "Firewood stacked and covered," he reported. "Checked the barn roof for leaks and reinforced the chicken coop against wind. Should be ready for whatever winter throws at us." Martha appreciated his thoroughness, recognizing how naturally he'd assumed responsibility for protecting their shared home. His mining background had taught him to anticipate problems before they became crises, a skill that served them well in mountain living. "Emma, help me prepare hot chocolate while your papa changes into dry clothes," Martha suggested, wanting to reward their hard work with comfort. As Emma carefully measured milk under Martha's supervision, she chatted about the snow's beauty and her hopes for sledding once accumulation deepened. Her enthusiasm for winter activities reminded Martha of childhood pleasures she'd forgotten existed. "Will we have Christmas here?" Emma asked with casual assumption that made Martha's heart skip. "I mean, all three of us together." Martha exchanged glances with Thomas, who'd emerged from the spare room in dry clothes. Their formal agreement had specified evaluation after spring planting, but none of them had discussed holidays or the emotional implications of celebrating them together. "Christmas is still weeks away," Martha said carefully. "We'll see how things develop." But Emma's question planted seeds that grew through the following days as winter settled over their mountain home with serious intent. The approaching holiday forced Martha to confront feelings she'd been avoiding, particularly the growing attachment that made their arrangement feel less like business and more like family. Thomas worked with renewed dedication as temperatures dropped, ensuring their comfort and safety through the dark months ahead. Martha watched him move through daily tasks with competence that impressed her and Emma with devotion that touched her heart. One evening, as they sat around the fireplace Thomas had improved with a new damper system, Martha found herself studying Samuel's watch again. The frozen hands seemed less like memorial and more like impediment, keeping her anchored to grief instead of allowing movement toward whatever lay ahead. "Something troubling you?" Thomas asked, noticing her preoccupation. Martha hesitated, then made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. "I've been holding on to something that belongs in the past." She showed him the pocket watch, explaining its significance, while Emma listened with the gravity children brought to adult confidences. "Samuel carried this, but it stopped working years ago. I kept it anyway, like keeping time stopped would keep him closer." Thomas examined the watch with respectful hands. "Beautiful craftsmanship. Means a lot to you." "It did, but I'm starting to think holding on to broken things prevents us from appreciating what works." Martha's voice carried conviction that surprised her. "Maybe it's time to let go of what's finished and focus on what's beginning." Emma, with the wisdom that sometimes emerged from innocence, asked the question that cut to the heart of Martha's struggle. "Does letting go of sad things mean you stop loving the people who made you sad?" Martha pulled Emma closer, understanding that her decision affected more than her own healing. "No, sweetheart. It means loving them enough to let yourself be happy again." That night, Martha wrapped Samuel's pocket watch in the handkerchief that had held it for 8 years and placed the package in her memory box. The gesture felt like completing a long journey rather than abandoning a cherished possession. Thomas watched this quiet ceremony with understanding, recognizing the courage required to release past love in order to embrace present possibilities. His own grief over Emma's mother had taught him similar lessons about holding and letting go. The anonymous letter arrived with the Monday mail delivery, its harsh words scrawled in handwriting, designed to conceal the author's identity. Martha discovered it, tucked between seed catalogues and supply invoices, the envelope bearing only her name in block letters that dripped with disapproval and threat. "Shameful woman," the letter began, its crude language attacking Martha's character and questioning her moral fitness. "Living in sin with a man not your husband, corrupting an innocent child with your wicked example, God-fearing people won't tolerate such behavior much longer." The letter continued with increasingly vicious accusations, suggesting Martha had lured Thomas into improper relations and predicting divine punishment for their sinful arrangement. The final lines contained veiled threats about community action if they didn't correct their situation immediately. Martha's hands trembled as she read, not from fear but from rage at the anonymous coward who dared judge her life while hiding behind unsigned accusations. 8 years of earning respect through honest work and fair dealing meant nothing to whoever had penned this poison. Thomas found her standing in the kitchen, the letter clutched in white-knuckled fists, her face pale with fury rather than shame. "What's wrong?" She handed him the letter without speaking, watching his expression darken as he read the hateful words. Emma played contentedly near the fireplace, oblivious to the adult crisis unfolding around her. "Say it would," Thomas said finally, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Anyone brave enough to judge us should be brave enough to sign their name. It's working exactly as intended," Martha replied bitterly, "making us doubt ourselves, feel defensive about choices that harm no one." The letter's timing struck Martha as particularly cruel, arriving just as she'd begun allowing herself to hope for happiness beyond mere survival. Someone in Cedar Ridge had watched their growing contentment and decided to poison it with judgment and threat. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Thomas asked, studying the crude lettering for clues about its author. Martha shook her head. "Could be anyone. Half the town probably disapproves of our arrangement, even if they're too polite to say so directly." The accusations stung because they contained enough truth to feel dangerous. Martha and Thomas had grown closer than their formal contract specified, their relationship evolving beyond employer and employee into something neither had acknowledged openly. "We could marry," Thomas said quietly, the words emerging as statement rather than proposal, "solve the problem of appearances." Martha felt her heart race at his practical suggestion, recognizing both its wisdom and its inadequacy. Marriage to satisfy gossips isn't the same as marriage for love. "No," Thomas agreed, "but it would protect Emma from ugly rumors and give you legal standing if anyone challenges your reputation formally." The letter's threat extended beyond personal attack to potential action by town authorities or church leadership. Martha's independence depended on community tolerance, and organized opposition could make her life extremely difficult. Emma's innocent voice interrupted their discussion. "Why do you both look mad? Did something bad happen?" Martha forced her expression into calmer lines, unwilling to burden the child with adult complexities. "Just dealing with some unpleasant male, sweetheart. Nothing for you to worry about." But Emma's perceptive eyes missed nothing, and Martha knew the child sensed undercurrents of tension that hadn't existed before the letter's arrival. Their peaceful household had been invaded by outside judgment that threatened everything they'd built together. "We could ignore it," Thomas suggested. "People with courage to make accusations face to face deserve responses. Anonymous cowards don't." Martha appreciated his protective instincts while recognizing the naivety of his approach. "Ignoring poison doesn't make it less dangerous. Whoever wrote this won't stop with one letter." The afternoon brought confirmation of Martha's fears when Mrs. Henderson visited with thinly veiled concern about certain situations that might reflect poorly on our Christian community. Her diplomatic language barely concealed judgment as sharp as the anonymous letter's crude attacks. "People are talking, Martha," Mrs. Henderson said over unwelcome tea. "A respectable widow living alone with an unmarried man and his child. It creates unfortunate impressions." "Unfortunate for whom?" Martha replied coolly. "Thomas works hard, Emma's education continues properly, and no one's being harmed by our arrangement. Appearances matter, dear. Young Emma's reputation could suffer from association with irregular circumstances. Have you considered how this affects her future prospects?" The subtle threat beneath Mrs. Henderson's concern became clear: conform to social expectations or watch Emma pay the price for adult decisions. Martha felt trapped between protecting the child and maintaining the independence she'd fought to establish. After Mrs. Henderson departed, Martha sat alone with the anonymous letter, understanding that its author had calculated exactly the right pressure points to achieve maximum damage. Someone knew her well enough to predict that threats to Emma would prove more effective than personal attacks. The letter represented everything Martha had learned to despise about small-town conformity: the assumption that others' opinions mattered more than personal happiness, the demand that individual choices conform to collective judgment, the willingness to destroy rather than simply disapprove. Emma discovered the hidden diary pages while exploring Martha's attic on a snowy afternoon, her curiosity leading her to a trunk that contained secrets Martha had never intended to share. The yellowed papers fluttered to the floor like autumn leaves, revealing Martha's private thoughts written during her darkest period of grief and desperation. "Miss Martha," Emma called down the attic stairs, her voice uncertain. "I found some papers with your writing on them. Should I bring them down?" Martha's blood chilled as she recognized the distinctive blue paper she'd used for journaling during those terrible months after Samuel and Sarah's deaths. The diary contained raw emotions and desperate thoughts she'd poured onto pages during nights when sleep brought only nightmares. "Bring them here, sweetheart," Martha said, climbing the narrow stairs with growing dread. "Those are private papers that shouldn't have been left where curious little hands could find them." Emma handed over the scattered pages with the solemn expression of a child who sensed she'd uncovered something significant. Martha's heart sank as she recognized entries from her darkest period, when grief had driven her to the edge of despair. The pages revealed truth Martha had hidden even from herself. She wasn't just Martha Blackwood, respectable widow who'd come west for a fresh start. She was Martha Catherine Blackwood, formerly Martha Catherine Morrison, daughter of Judge Harrison Morrison of St. Louis, Missouri. A woman from wealth and privilege who'd fled scandal as much as sorrow. Thomas appeared at the bottom of the attic stairs, drawn by the unusual quiet that had replaced Emma's normal chatter. "Everything all right up there?" Martha descended slowly, the diary pages clutched against her chest like a shield that could no longer protect her secrets. "We need to talk. Emma, would you please feed the chickens while your papa and I discuss some grown-up matters?" Emma departed with obvious reluctance, sensing drama she wasn't allowed to witness. Martha led Thomas to the parlor where winter light filtered through windows, overlooking the snow-covered valley that had become her sanctuary. "I haven't been entirely honest about my background," Martha began, her voice steady despite internal trembling. "These papers contain information that changes everything you think you know about me." Thomas accepted the diary pages with careful hands, his expression growing concerned as he recognized the emotional weight Martha carried. "Whatever those papers say, it doesn't change who you are now, doesn't it?" Martha's laugh carried bitter undertones. "I'm not just a widow who lost her family to tragedy. I'm the daughter of a prominent judge who fled St. Louis in disgrace after my husband and daughter died in a carriage accident that was entirely my fault." The words emerged in a rush, 8 years of suppressed guilt and shame pouring out like water through a broken dam. Thomas read silently while Martha paced, unable to sit still while her carefully constructed identity crumbled around her. "Samuel had been drinking because we'd argued about money," Martha continued, her voice breaking despite her determination to remain composed. "He took Sarah for a drive to escape my nagging about his business failures. The carriage overturned because he was too drunk to control the horses properly." Thomas looked up from the pages, his expression compassionate rather than judgmental. "You blamed yourself for someone else's choices. I drove him to drink that day with my criticism and disappointment. If I'd been a better wife, more supportive, less demanding, they'd still be alive." Martha's voice cracked as she spoke aloud thoughts that had tormented her for years. "The scandal destroyed my family's reputation," she continued. "Judge Morrison's daughter married to a drunk who killed himself and his child through reckless behavior. I couldn't stay in St. Louis, couldn't face the whispers and pointed fingers." The diary entries Thomas was reading contained even darker revelations: Martha's contemplation of suicide during her worst moments, her complete loss of faith in God's goodness, her decision to flee west under an assumed identity to escape judgment and memory. "So you see," Martha concluded. "I'm not the respectable widow you thought you knew. I'm a woman who destroyed her own family through selfish behavior and then ran away rather than face the consequences." Thomas set the diary pages aside and stood, his movement deliberate and calm. "You're a woman who lost her family tragically and blamed herself for circumstances beyond her control. You don't understand the full truth yet," Martha protested. "My father disowned me after the funeral, said I'd brought shame on the Morrison name and wasn't welcome in his house anymore. I took my inheritance and disappeared, became Martha Blackwood instead of Martha Morrison. What I understand," Thomas said firmly, "is that grief makes people believe terrible things about themselves. What I understand is that you've spent 8 years punishing yourself for someone else's choices." The revelation hung between them like a physical presence, changing the foundation of everything they'd built together. Martha waited for Thomas's disgust, his withdrawal, his recognition that she'd deceived him about her fundamental identity. Thomas retrieved the official document from Martha's trunk the next morning, the legal certificate that proved her story beyond any doubt. The deed transfer showed Martha Catherine Morrison purchasing 300 acres in Montana Territory under the name Martha Catherine Blackwood, witnessed by territorial officials who'd accepted her false identity without question. "This is what convinced you I'd deceived you deliberately," Martha said, watching Thomas examine the document with careful attention. "The legal proof that I created a new identity to escape my past." The certificate bore official seals and signatures that validated Martha's transformation from privileged judge's daughter to self-sufficient mountain woman. Every detail had been arranged to ensure her past couldn't follow her west, creating legal barriers between her former life and chosen isolation. "You must have planned this escape very thoroughly," Thomas observed, noting the date that placed her land purchase just 3 months after her family's deaths. "This level of documentation requires significant resources and connections." Martha nodded, remembering the desperate efficiency with which she'd arranged her disappearance. "My father's legal connections helped, ironically. He wanted me gone quickly and quietly before the scandal damaged his judicial reputation further." The morning's revelation had shattered Thomas's understanding of their relationship's foundation. The woman he'd grown to love had constructed her entire identity around lies designed to hide truth she considered shameful. Every conversation, every shared confidence, every moment of growing intimacy had been built on deception. "I need time to think," Thomas said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "This changes everything I thought I knew about you." Martha felt her heart break as she watched him withdraw emotionally, the warmth and trust they'd developed over months disappearing behind walls of hurt and confusion. She'd known this moment would come eventually, but anticipating pain hadn't prepared her for its devastating reality. Emma sensed the tension immediately upon returning from her chores, her perceptive eyes moving between the adults whose body language screamed of crisis. "Why does everyone look sad? Did I do something wrong by finding those papers?" "You did nothing wrong, sweetheart," Martha assured her, though guilt over involving the child in adult complications added weight to her existing burden. "Sometimes grown-ups have difficult conversations about complicated things." Thomas spent the day working with mechanical efficiency, completing necessary tasks while avoiding personal interaction with Martha. She respected his need for space while feeling the growing distance between them like physical pain. The official document lay on the kitchen table throughout the day, a constant reminder of the legal fiction that had allowed Martha to rebuild her life. She'd paid lawyers handsomely to create documentation that would withstand scrutiny, ensuring her past couldn't destroy her future through official channels. Emma's bedtime routine became strained as Thomas read her story with distracted attention, while Martha prepared tomorrow's lessons with forced normalcy. The child's questions about their obvious tension received careful non-answers that satisfied no one. "Are you and Papa having a fight?" Emma asked Martha privately while Thomas checked the animals one final time. "We're working through some difficult feelings," Martha replied honestly. "Sometimes adults need to figure out complicated things about trust and honesty. But you still love each other, right?" Emma's innocent question cut straight to the heart of Martha's fears. "Love is more complicated than you understand yet, sweetheart. Sometimes loving someone means respecting their need to make their own decisions about what they can accept." After Emma slept, Martha and Thomas sat in their usual evening spots around the fireplace, but the comfortable intimacy that had developed between them was replaced by careful distance. The official document lay between them like evidence in a trial, where Martha stood accused of fundamental deception. "I understand why you're angry," Martha began, needing to break the silence that felt more painful than any argument. "I should have told you the truth from the beginning." "Should you have?" Thomas asked, his tone suggesting genuine curiosity rather than accusation. "Would knowing about Judge Morrison's disgraced daughter have changed my decision to accept work here?" Martha considered his question seriously, recognizing its complexity. "Probably. Most men would hesitate to associate with a woman whose past included scandal and family destruction. Most men judge women by their father's positions rather than their own character," Thomas replied. "I'm trying to decide whether that kind of judgment is fair or practical." The legal document represented more than proof of Martha's deception. It symbolized the gulf between their social backgrounds and the careful construction required to bridge that distance. Thomas came from honest poverty, while Martha fled from wealthy disgrace, their paths crossing only through deliberate misrepresentation. "The question isn't whether you deceived me," Thomas said finally. "The question is whether the woman I've grown to love actually exists, or whether she's as fictional as the name on that deed." Martha's packed trunk sat by her bedroom door like a silent testament to her deepest fear, that love could never survive complete honesty. She'd filled it methodically during the sleepless hours, after Thomas's devastating question about whether the woman he loved actually existed, each folded garment representing another step toward the isolation she'd sworn never to endure again. The trunk contained everything she'd owned when arriving in Montana 8 years ago, plus precious few additions accumulated during her mountain exile. Unlike her arrival, when necessity had driven her west, this departure would be pure choice, an act of self-preservation disguised as noble sacrifice. Thomas found her in the kitchen before dawn, already dressed for travel, her coffee cup sitting untouched as she stared out the window at snow that had fallen throughout the night. The storm would make traveling treacherous, but Martha seemed determined to leave regardless of weather conditions. "You're really going," he said, the statement carrying resignation rather than surprise. "It's for the best," Martha replied without turning around. "Emma doesn't deserve to be caught between our complications, and you deserve someone who can be honest from the beginning." Thomas sat across from her at the table where they'd shared so many comfortable conversations, noting how carefully she avoided meeting his eyes. "Running away doesn't solve the problem of who you are. It solves the problem of who I'm not," Martha countered. "I'm not the simple widow you thought you knew. I'm not someone who deserves the trust you've offered. I'm certainly not someone who should be responsible for raising your daughter." The trunk's presence dominated the room like an accusation, representing Martha's inability to believe that love could coexist with complete knowledge of her failures. She'd spent 8 years building walls against exactly this scenario, being truly known and subsequently rejected. "Emma will be heartbroken," Thomas said quietly, though his voice carried more concern for Martha's pain than criticism of her decision. "Emma will adapt. Children are remarkably resilient when adults stop involving them in situations they can't understand." Martha's practical tone masked the emotional devastation of leaving the child who'd reawakened her maternal instincts. "And where will you go? Back to St. Louis to face the past you've been running from?" Martha shook her head, finally meeting his gaze with eyes that held years of accumulated sorrow. "Somewhere new. California, maybe, or Oregon Territory. Somewhere I can start over again without lies this time." The irony wasn't lost on Thomas that Martha's commitment to honesty was driving her toward another geographical escape from emotional complexity. Her pattern of running when life became difficult was repeating despite her claims of newfound integrity. "What if I asked you to stay?" Thomas asked, his voice careful as he ventured onto dangerous emotional ground. "Why would you do that? You know the truth about me now. You know I destroyed my own family through selfishness and then lied about it for years. I know you're a woman who's been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you," Thomas replied firmly. "I know you've spent 8 years punishing yourself for someone else's choices, and I know the woman who's raised my daughter with love and patience is real, regardless of what name she uses." Martha felt tears threaten despite her determination to maintain composure. "You can't possibly forgive deception this fundamental." I can forgive anything except your refusal to believe you deserve happiness." Thomas reached across the table, covering her hands with his own. "The question isn't whether you lied about your past. The question is whether you're brave enough to trust me with your future." Emma's sleepy voice interrupted their conversation as she appeared in the kitchen, drawn by voices that suggested something important was happening. Her eyes immediately focused on the trunk, understanding its implications with the frightening perceptiveness of childhood. "Miss Martha, are you leaving us?" Emma's question held devastation that made both adults' hearts ache. Martha knelt to Emma's level, struggling to find words that would explain adult complexities to a child's heart. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that hurt the people they love. I thought it might be better if I went away rather than cause more problems. But I don't want you to go away," Emma said simply. "I love you even if you made mistakes. Papa makes mistakes too, and I still love him." The child's uncomplicated acceptance of human imperfection struck Martha like physical blow, revealing the truth she'd been avoiding. Her decision to leave was based on shame rather than necessity, on her inability to accept forgiveness rather than others' inability to offer it. "Staying would mean facing people in town who know the truth about my past," Martha said, testing whether Emma understood the social complications that awaited them. "So," Emma replied with the fearless logic of innocence, "their opinions don't live in our house." Thomas's marriage proposal letter lay spread across the kitchen table, in careful handwriting that had taken him 3 attempts to perfect, each word chosen to express feelings that conversation couldn't adequately convey. He'd written it during the long night hours while Martha packed her trunk, understanding that actions meant more than arguments in convincing her to stay. "Martha Catherine Morrison Blackwood," the letter began, using her full name to demonstrate his acceptance of her complete identity. "I'm writing this because spoken words seem inadequate for what needs to be said, and because you deserve a proposal that acknowledges who you really are, rather than who you thought I wanted you to be." Martha's hands trembled as she read his careful script, recognizing the courage required to put such vulnerable feelings into permanent words. The letter represented everything she'd convinced herself was impossible: complete acceptance paired with genuine love. "I'm not proposing to the simple widow Martha Blackwood, because that woman never existed except in our mutual imagination," Thomas continued. "I'm proposing to Martha Morrison, who survived unimaginable tragedy and rebuilt her life through determination and strength. I'm proposing to the woman who saved my daughter and me from despair by accepting us into her home and heart." Emma sat beside Martha, following along as she read aloud, the child's presence serving as witness to this moment that would determine their future. Her small hand rested on Martha's arm, providing comfort and encouragement as the letter revealed Thomas's deepest thoughts. "Your past doesn't frighten me," the letter continued. "What frightens me is the possibility that shame will drive you away from the happiness we've found together. Judge Morrison's daughter brings qualities to our relationship that a simple frontier widow couldn't offer: education, refinement, understanding of complex social situations that will serve Emma well as she grows." Martha felt tears begin to flow as Thomas's words dismantled every argument she'd constructed for leaving. He wasn't tolerating her deception, he was celebrating the complexity that made her who she was. "I love your determination to protect Emma from gossip, but I love more your courage in facing whatever consequences come from living authentically. I love your guilt over past mistakes because it proves you have conscience and heart. I love your fear of being unworthy because it means you understand the value of what we're building." Thomas emerged from the barn where he'd been completing morning chores, snow dusting his shoulders as he joined them in the kitchen. His eyes met Martha's over the letter, his expression hopeful but prepared for rejection. "You wrote this while I was planning to run away," Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wrote it because you were planning to run away," Thomas replied. "Seemed important to make sure you understood what you'd be leaving behind." Emma bounced with excitement as the letter's implications became clear. "Does this mean you're asking Miss Martha to marry you? Does this mean we can all stay together forever?" "That depends on Miss Martha's answer," Thomas said gently, his gaze never leaving Martha's face. "Marriage is a big decision that affects everyone involved." Martha reread portions of the letter, searching for hidden conditions or expectations that might make acceptance impossible. Instead, she found only love expressed with patience and understanding that took her breath away. "The proposal comes with conditions," she said finally, testing whether Thomas had considered practical implications of their union. "Name them. I won't pretend to be someone I'm not anymore. If we marry, it will be as Martha Morrison, who chose to become Martha Blackwood, not as a simple widow with no complicated past." Thomas nodded immediately. "Agreed. What else? Emma's education continues to be a priority. I want her to have opportunities I never had, including college if she chooses." "Already planned for that," Thomas assured her. "What else? We tell the truth to anyone who asks about my background. No more lies, no more evasions, no matter how uncomfortable the conversations become." "Fair enough. Any other conditions?" Martha looked around the kitchen that had become the heart of their unconventional family, noting details that represented months of shared life. Emma's drawings on the wall, Thomas's coffee cup in its accustomed place, the comfortable disorder that came from people living together harmoniously. "Just one more," she said, her voice gaining strength as decision crystallized into certainty. "This marriage is based on love, not convenience or social pressure. If you're proposing to solve the gossip problem, I'd rather face scandal alone." Thomas crossed to her chair, kneeling beside it as he took her hands in his work-roughened ones. "Martha Morrison, I'm proposing because living without you would be like losing my other half. Will you marry me?" Emma held her breath as Martha considered the question that would reshape all their lives, the marriage proposal letter lying between them like a bridge across the chasm of her fears. The simple gold wedding rings gleamed in the spring sunlight streaming through the church windows, their understated elegance reflecting the honest love they would symbolize. Martha had chosen them carefully from the jeweler's modest selection in town, preferring their plain beauty to ornate designs that might suggest pretension or wealth. Pastor Williams performed the ceremony with dignity that surprised Martha, given his earlier concerns about their living arrangement. The community had gathered in numbers that spoke to grudging acceptance rather than enthusiastic approval, but their presence represented progress from the hostile letters and whispered gossip of winter months. Emma stood beside Martha as maid of honor, her small hands clutching a bouquet of wild flowers that matched the larger arrangement Martha carried. The child's joy radiated through the church, her obvious happiness helping to soften resistance from community members who'd questioned the wisdom of their unusual family formation. Frank Collins served as Thomas's best man, his presence representing the friendship that had sustained Thomas through difficult transitions. The dairy farmer had stayed in Cedar Ridge despite selling his land to developers, using his proceeds to purchase a smaller property where he and Mary could live comfortably without the demands of large-scale farming. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Williams began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned to separate personal judgment from pastoral duty. "We are gathered here today to witness the union of Thomas Sullivan and Martha Morrison Blackwood in holy matrimony." Martha felt a tremor of nervousness at hearing her full name spoken publicly for the first time since arriving in Montana. She'd insisted on honesty about her identity, and the announcement represented her commitment to living authentically, regardless of community reaction. Thomas's hand squeezed hers reassuringly as they exchanged vows that promised mutual support through whatever challenges lay ahead. His steady presence calmed her fears about public judgment, reminding her that their love mattered more than others' opinions. "Do you, Thomas Sullivan, take Martha Morrison Blackwood to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" "I do," Thomas replied firmly, his voice carrying across the church with conviction that left no doubt about his commitment. "Do you, Martha Morrison Blackwood, take Thomas Sullivan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, till death do you part?" Martha's "I do" emerged strong and clear, her acceptance representing victory over years of self-imposed isolation and shame. The words felt like liberation rather than obligation, freedom to love openly rather than guardedly. Emma practically bounced with excitement as Thomas slipped the wedding ring onto Martha's finger, the gold band joining her hand with his in symbolic unity that made their unconventional family legally recognized. The child had waited months for this moment, understanding instinctively that marriage would secure their life together permanently. The reception took place in the church hall, with community members contributing food and well wishes that reflected cautious acceptance of their union. Mrs. Henderson's presence particularly pleased Martha, representing approval from someone whose opinion carried weight in local social circles. "Beautiful ceremony," Mrs. Henderson commented, sampling Martha's wedding cake with obvious appreciation. Pastor Williams performed it with appropriate dignity. Martha thanked her while recognizing the diplomatic language that avoided direct commentary on their relationship's unconventional beginning. Community acceptance would come gradually, earned through continued demonstration of respectability and devotion to family values. Emma charmed everyone at the reception, her innocent happiness serving as evidence that their marriage benefited rather than harmed the child, whose welfare had been questioned by critics. Her obvious love for both Martha and Thomas reassured community members that their union served worthy purposes beyond adult convenience. Thomas's quiet dignity throughout the celebration impressed people who'd known him only as the struggling widower, seeking work wherever it could be found. Marriage to Martha elevated his social standing while providing him with partnership that promised prosperity and stability. The new wedding rings caught afternoon light as Thomas and Martha danced their first dance as husband and wife, the simple gold bands representing promises they intended to keep, regardless of whatever difficulties lay ahead. Emma clapped along with the music, her delight infectious enough to spread smiles throughout the assembled community. As evening approached, the newlyweds prepared to depart for their mountain home, their official union complete, but their real life together just beginning. The wedding rings would serve as daily reminders of vows exchanged publicly, promises made before God and community that transformed their arrangement into something sacred and permanent. Frank Collins helped load wedding gifts into their wagon, his friendship providing continuity between Thomas's old life and new beginning. "Good match," he told Thomas privately. "Martha's exactly what you and Emma needed." The wedding rings gleamed as Martha gathered her skirts for the wagon ride home, their simple beauty reflecting the honest love that had brought three lonely people together into something stronger than the sum of their individual struggles. The family photograph captured a moment of perfect contentment on their front porch, 2 years after the wedding, Emma now 9 years old and radiant with the security that came from belonging completely to people who loved her unconditionally. The traveling photographer had arranged them carefully, Thomas standing behind Martha's chair, his hands resting protectively on her shoulders, while Emma sat beside her with Duchess purring in her lap. "Hold very still," the photographer instructed, preparing his equipment with the precision required for clear images. "This will preserve this moment for generations to come." Martha smiled genuinely for the camera, no longer the grief-stricken woman who'd fled to Montana 8 years ago, or the fearful widow who'd almost run away rather than face the truth about love's possibilities. Marriage to Thomas had restored her faith in happiness, while Emma's presence had reawakened maternal joy she'd thought permanently lost. Emma had grown into her role as their daughter with natural grace, her education progressing under Martha's careful guidance, while her character developed through Thomas's patient example. The child who'd once begged a stranger to take her father had become a confident young girl, secure in her family's affection and support. "Miss Martha, will you tell my children about how I asked you to take Papa?" Emma asked while they waited for the photographer to complete his preparations. "I'll tell them about the bravest little girl I ever met," Martha replied, smoothing Emma's hair with gentle hands. "The girl who knew exactly what her family needed, even when the adults were too stubborn to see it clearly." Thomas chuckled at the memory of that desperate day in the town square when Emma's innocent plea had changed all their lives. "Your daughter has excellent judgment about people. She recognized your quality before I had sense enough to appreciate what was being offered." The mountain homestead had prospered under their combined efforts, the property expanding to include new outbuildings and improved livestock facilities that reflected their shared commitment to long-term success. Martha's business acumen combined with Thomas's practical skills had created an operation that provided comfortable living while serving as example of what determination and cooperation could achieve. Community acceptance had grown steadily as their marriage proved its worth through example rather than argument. Martha's true identity as Judge Morrison's daughter had become source of pride rather than scandal, her education and refinement adding distinction to Cedar Ridge's social fabric. "Everyone ready?" the photographer asked, adjusting his camera for optimal light conditions. The photograph would join others in Martha's collection, replacing images of loss with pictures of renewal and hope. She'd finally learned to create new memories rather than simply preserving old ones, understanding that honoring the past didn't require refusing the future. Emma's laughter filled their days with music that reminded Martha why children represented life's greatest blessing. The girl's questions, observations, and discoveries provided constant entertainment, while her affection for both adults sealed their unconventional family into something completely natural and right. Thomas had found purpose beyond mere survival in building something lasting with Martha, their partnership encompassing far more than the practical cooperation their original agreement had specified. Love had transformed obligation into joy, making even difficult work feel meaningful when shared with someone who understood its value. Perfect, the photographer announced, capturing their image at the precise moment when all three faces reflected genuine happiness. This will be a beautiful portrait. The photograph would preserve this golden period when their love felt new enough to surprise them daily, while established enough to provide security against whatever challenges might arise. Emma would treasure it in years to come as evidence of the family that began with a child's desperate faith in adult goodness. As they walked the photographer to his wagon, Martha reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of contentment. Emma's bold request had seemed impossible when first spoken, a child's naive belief that problems could be solved through simple human kindness. "Thank you," Martha whispered to Emma as they watched the photographer depart with his precious cargo, "for seeing what we needed before we knew to look for it ourselves." "Thank you for saying yes," Emma replied, understanding even at 9 that some moments required acknowledgement of their significance. Thomas wrapped his arms around both his girls, holding his complete family close as afternoon light painted their mountain home in shades of gold that promised many more perfect moments ahead. The photograph would fade with time, but the love it captured would only grow stronger through years of shared joy, mutual support, and the daily miracle of people who'd found exactly where they belonged. The little girl who'd begged a mountain woman to take her father had created something beautiful from desperate circumstances, proving that sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is ask for help from the right person at exactly the right moment.